You're listening to an IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education. Powered by UCL Minds.
This is Research for the Real World, conversations with researchers and the paths they've taken to help shape our everyday lives. Hello, I'm Dr. Humera Iqbal, and I'm a lecturer in psychology at the Thomas Corm Research Unit at the UCL Institute of Education. On this episode, we're delighted to have our very own Rob Webster, who's an associate professor at the Department of Psychology and Human Development here at the IOE. Rob was involved in the groundbreaking Deployment and Impact of Support Staff project and now leads the Maximising the Impact of Teaching Assistants initiative. So he really is an expert around what we're going to be speaking about today, which is the role of teaching assistants in schools in the UK. Hello, Rob. Welcome. How are you?
Hello, Humera. Nice to chat with you.
How's it going? What's been happening today?
Yeah, not too bad. As you know, we're doing a little burst of recording for the podcast series, and I'm speaking to you from inside a little fort I've constructed on my son's bed involving sofa cushions and pillows, and it really is quite the architectural work, I can tell you.
Amazing. Well, I'm going to ask you lots of stuff about teaching assistants because, we all want to hear more. But I want to begin by asking you, I heard in a past life you were a teaching assistant yourself. Is that right?
Yes, I was. Before I got into the research game, I was teaching assistant in, first of all, a secondary school, and then I did a stint in a special school, and then about a year and a bit in a primary setting. So I've kind of been about the phases and in different schools. So I think that's quite valuable when you do the job that we do in research. It lends an authenticity. I always feel a little bit more when I'm talking the talk. I know that in a past life I've walked the walk. So it's been hugely informative, I think, in what I've done since.
I can imagine. But what was your turning point to academia? When did you decide to change paths?
I suppose the interest in social research generally and educational research more specifically came while I was doing my postgraduate. I did an MA in social policy, and there was lots of kind of room within there to explore different areas. I happened to chance on education and special needs and inclusion in particular. So I suppose that was kind of informed by spending time in schools, which I'd done several years by that point. And I think the course which I was really interested in was the research methods, social research methods, and decided that once I had graduated, I would try to sort of break into the social research world. And I guess I was just very, very fortunate in that I was in the right place at the right time when the right job came up. So I'd been looking in my thesis work on policies around the use of support staff in school, specifically teaching assistants. I sort of came from the perspective of writing about what I knew to some degree. And a job came up on a very large scale project at the IOE, the Deployment and Impact of Support Staff project. And I joined that, and I've been clinging on by my fingernails ever since.
The rest is history. Gosh, well, I think it just goes to show that it is so important to think about what you choose for your thesis work because it can live with you forever, really, can't it? So tell us more. Who are teaching assistants? What do they do? How have we come to have so many in our schools?
Okay, so the story of this teaching assistants goes back to the late 70s, early 80s, where we started to have in school parent helpers. So you'd have volunteers coming into school, helping in classrooms, usually with activities like arts and crafts or helping in the library or doing cooking or helping out on a school trip. And it wasn't. It started out as maybe one or two parents. It was frequently it was women, it was mothers who were coming in and doing this extra work on a voluntary basis. And over the course of the late 80s, I can't really pinpoint anything that precipitated it or made it happen, but the idea of having volunteers in schools seemed to really take off. And primary schools in particular started using this model to, I guess, to sort of expand the curriculum a bit and to just sort of manage activities where you needed extra pair of hands, like doing art and crafts or taking schools out on trips and so on. And over that time, given the number of people that there were in school, those roles started to drift a little bit more into something a little bit like teaching. So it started really with volunteers listening to children read. So they'd take 1 or 2, 3 children outside the classroom and they'd do some reading and they'd sort of monitor that and make some notes on it. And it just sort of grew from there. So when there was a bit more of a move to sort of formalize this into a role, the first people into those initial teaching assistant roles, classroom assistant roles, were these volunteers. So it was the workforce was originally sort of fashioned, if you like, from these volunteer parent helpers. And one of the big triggers for this is it really kind of kicks off in the 90s, really, the pace with which we move towards more inclusive schools. So children who had special educational needs and disabilities, they are, it's not the default setting to put them into a special school. There are more sort of rights and there's a more of, I guess, a sort of social response really to having and allowing and accommodating, integrating children with particular needs into mainstream settings. And one of the big ways in which we facilitated that was to formalise this workforce. So we had these teaching assistants, learning support assistants as they're sometimes known, and their primary role started to be reformed around supporting the learning needs and the social needs, and sometimes the emotional needs of children with special needs.
Rob, but when you say formalized, does that mean that, teaching assistants had to sort of undergo training or kind of do they have to have qualifications in order to be teaching assistants? What goes on there?
I suppose it's formalised in the sense that it becomes paid work and not voluntary, and there's a contract to go alongside it. But we've never really, in all of these years or decades even, haven't formalised it in the sense of a profession, if you like. So there is no entry level requirement. So with teachers, we expect them to have a degree, and we also expect them to have obtained qualified teacher status, and there are various ways in which that they can do that. But there isn't an equivalent with teaching assistants. There's no requirement for them to have a basic level of qualification, although most schools do sort of take it upon themselves when they advertise TA roles to make sure there's a sort of minimum GCSE requirement for English and maths in primary and secondary settings, and very often specialist settings too. So that sort of come about fairly organically, but there's no training once you're in the role either. There was a time where local authorities would put things in for induction, but that's tailed off over the years, and there's certainly not been a formal requirement, let's say from government or in any incarnation, that there should be an entry level requirement that you either have or you work towards when you start the job.
That's really interesting, particularly because of, the groups of children and young people that teaching assistants work with, for sure. But when I was reading kind of the notes and kind of reading about this before speaking to you, I read that in the UK, on the basis of head count, the number of teaching assistants we have is equivalent to the population of Iceland. Is that right?
Yes, it is, believe it or not. Inclusion was a huge catalyst for this. There have been some other things along the way as well. The national literacy and numeracy strategies, which were there to boost children who were falling behind a little bit in English and maths, and teaching assistants were involved in the sort of delivery of some of those lessons and some of those sort of interventions, if you like. And then there was a really big one about almost sort of the turn of the century, really, where there was quite a crisis with teacher recruitment and retention. It was all sort of centred on teachers being overloaded, overworked. And the government's response to that, in collaboration with unions and local government employers, was to really up the number of support staff, not just teaching assistants, but other support staff who would do sort of non-teaching roles and stuff to do with attendance, perhaps, to try to take some of that workload off teachers and make schools function a bit. They weren't so entirely reliant on teachers and leaders doing everything. We had this growing support workforce, and it was through those things that we started to accrue these huge numbers. So at the moment, About 28, I think it is, percent of our school's workforce are working as teaching assistants, and that does differ slightly in the phases. So there are about as many, on the basis of sort of full-time equivalents, there are about as many teaching assistants as there are teachers in the special schools. You see fewer TAs in secondary settings, but in our nursery and primary settings, teaching assistants, they make up about a third of the workforce. And as you say, that's on the basis of headcount. It's somewhere in the order of about 340, 350,000 people. So the equivalent, the population of Iceland. So it's a huge number of people. You think about that in terms of capacity. There was obviously expenditure involved with that. There are a lot of people in our schools who are sort of quietly holding them together, I think.
Absolutely. That's a huge, huge number. And I haven't been to Iceland yet, but I can envisage this huge number of teaching assistants. But given the fact that, there are so many teaching assistants and they're this great resource, what does the evidence tell us? And this is like, I really want to hear about your work because it's so important here. So what does the evidence tell us about teaching assistants? Are they kind of seen as a very valuable resource? Have they been seen to kind of really help children progress? Or what does it say about effective teaching assistants are in schools?
One of your points there about the perception of value, I mean, that's almost taken for granted. You'd struggle to find a school in the UK where the teachers and the leadership don't value the TAs. They will talk very enthusiastically, very passionately about the value that they bring to the school. As I sort of intimated just a moment ago, when it comes to inclusion, they are kind of mortar in the brickwork. We can have inclusive schools really because we have teaching assistants. Without teaching assistants, we probably won't have inclusive schools. So in that sense, they're making a huge contribution. When you get down to the question of impact, so the hard and fast in terms of, well, does having teaching assistants in our classrooms make any difference to learning outcomes for pupils? The evidence is a bit of a mixed bag. I suppose I should say, first of all, that it's a maturing evidence base, and there isn't decades of research behind it. I think that's started to grow with perhaps within the last sort of 15 years or so. When it comes to learning, there are sort of two ways of thinking about this where the evidence points. The first one is in terms of how we use teaching assistants to deliver intervention programs. So it's very common in schools for children who are falling behind in their reading or their phonics to spend a bit of time outside the classroom with a teaching assistant who takes them through a structured program of developing up those skills. And the evidence on that is somewhat unheralded, I think. There is really good, really consistent evidence, a lot of it from the UK, that when you train TAs to deliver these interventions and you put them into place properly, and those two really important caveats, when you get those things right, then you see children make progress. So just to take for instance, the Education Endowment Foundation have funded something like 9 or 10 trials of TA-led interventions, and almost all of them have come back with a positive outcome. So there is really something brilliant, and we don't kind of make much of it as I think we probably should do, but some of the impacts range from 1 month's additional progress right up to 3, even 4 months
Mhm.
additional progress, but they average out to around 3 months. We can say on the basis of the evidence that if we use TAs in this way, it's not unreasonable to expect some kind of positive impact. But teaching assistants, they don't spend all of their time doing interventions outside the classroom. In fact, most of the time, majority of TAs, the majority of the time, are working inside the classroom and they're supporting what's going on in there. And the evidence on that points in a somewhat more troubling direction. And that's work that we did at the IOE on the deployment and impact of support staff study. So this was work we did between, I think it was 2004, 2009. It was a big, large-scale, longitudinal study where we tried to address this question of what's happening in the other times, not when TAs are doing interventions, but when they're in the classroom. And what we found there was quite troubling, and it was pointing in the other direction. Essentially, what we found was that the TAs were, not entirely unexpectedly, were working on a one-to-one or group basis with the children who were struggling most, including, of course, the children with special needs. And what we found was the more support these children received from TAs, the less well they did in English and maths and science compared to kids who didn't have support from teaching assistants. And that was a very consistent finding across primary and secondary classrooms.
That just sounds so counterintuitive, though. I mean, that must have created like a big shockwaves when the kind of research results came out. I mean, why is that the case?
Well, it did, and it was really important for us to explain what was happening here, because you could easily run away with the idea that the problem is located within the teaching assistants. They must be doing something wrong then if children aren't making progress as a result of the support they're getting. It would be better for them to not have any support at all. But what was going on was a lot more involved than that. There was a story to be told, not about the teaching assistants themselves, but how they were being deployed and how they were being prepared. So the best way of explaining this, in a way, wasn't as in terms of decisions that teaching assistants were making. It was the decisions that were being made about them by school leaders and, to a slightly lesser extent, teachers. So what we found was that the reason you have this counterintuitive finding is that if you deploy TAs to work with children who struggle most, and they do that most of the time, then that comes at a cost. Those children will see the teacher less often. And then we've got really good evidence now over several studies, including the DIS project, which shows that differential. If you are a child who has special educational needs, you will see the teacher a lot less over the course of the week and spend a lot less time in the classroom and the whole class teaching context than typically developing children. So in a sense, that you might sort of defend that if the quality of what those children who get the support are receiving is at least as good as what you expect from a teacher. But there are problems there, not least because we don't, as we've already said, we don't train teaching assistants in knowing what to do, giving them a skill set in which they can children progress. A lot of them are just kind of making it up as they go along, because that sort of strategic vision, if you like, is missing. So the teaching assistants are doing the very best they can. Everything they're doing is with the very best of intentions. But what we see at the interaction level, the moments in which TAs are talking to pupils, is that the TAs tend to focus on getting tasks completed and getting the task completed correctly. So that sort of drives a certain type of interaction in the classroom, where the children over time get quite used to the TA doing the work for them, and they develop a sort of learned helplessness, and the opportunities for independence are eroded. And as we said, the sort of third factor of this, and this is a very persistent problem in schools, it's just there really isn't the time given for teachers and TAs to get together, to talk about lessons, to feedback afterwards, and to really kind of shape what the role and the contribution of the TAs are going to be in school. So, and we were very, very mindful when we published the findings to try to get that message out. The worst thing we thought that could happen is the wrong message gets out and people think that this is somehow a commentary on how poor TAs are and how poor their practice is. And our view of that was and remains that that's not the case at all. There's a huge amount of potential there. And the challenge ahead is unlocking it.
That was probably a huge responsibility to kind of get that right, because it must have had to be done very sensitively, because as you say, TAs are doing their best. But I mean, does that then say something about then how TAs are used by schools? Is it something to do with kind of decisions that are made about where they're placed, or did you do any research about this, about how to make it, how things could change? Or
Yeah, a lot of what we've done, a lot of what I've been involved with since the DIS project is addressing practical implications of this. One thing that I really took away from that experience of being involved in a large scale project, and of course that was my first experience of that as a researcher, was that it's kind of not enough as a researcher to do the work and then present it particularly to practitioners, to school leaders or SEN coordinators in schools, which I did a lot of after the findings came out. It's not enough to just say, this is what we did, this is how we did it, and this is what we found. Because as interested as these people might be in research, their role as practitioners ultimately sort of cuts through. And what they want to know is, okay, that's pretty concerning. What do I need to do about it? And in a sense, that's kind of set the journey off on a new pathway, which was, starting from the basis of the evidence. What do you do about it? What do you say to schools? What do you say to school leaders about how they should be doing things differently? And what evidence can you build to try and support these ideas? So for quite a few years now, we've been working on this initiative called Maximising the Impact of Teaching Assistants. And the idea of this is really to get first and foremost through to school leaders and to say, you may have heard about this research. This is what we think you need to be thinking about, and this is how you need to be responding to it. So, as part of that effort, we've put together lots and lots of practical, actionable guidance and resources that starts from what we know from the evidence and then builds on that with a sort of a series of steps that as a school leader you can take to reviewing the situations in your school and then making some changes. So just to sort of illustrate that perhaps a little bit better, we work with school leaders over the course of 2 or 3 terms. This is a long game where we talk about and we show them how to evaluate what they're doing, to sort of self-assess current practices against the evidence. For example, to what extent have your teachers and TAs got time across the week to meet and liaise? Because in many schools that will be happening in some classrooms and not in others.
Mm.
So it's identifying where things are working well in schools, because in every single school there is something that is working well, and then sort of building that up and scaling that up and getting that consistent across the school, while at the same time identifying where the less effective practices are and replacing them with something more appropriate. So instead of having teaching assistants correcting and completing work for children, they're talking to them in a way that's building their independence.
So, Rob, how many schools have you worked with this maximizing the impact of teaching assistants initiative? And I mean, do you have any is there a particular school that comes to mind where you were like, yes, this really worked, and you must have been you must be also really proud when you see that it's worked as well. But tell me a bit more about the numbers and.
To be honest, we don't know. I think it's probably around 600. We've been fortunate, I think, in the level of engagement with the work that we've had has kind of gone beyond what we could possibly measure. I mean, in terms of access. So we've written guidance report with the Education Endowment Foundation that got sent to every school in England. So we know that there's a lot of awareness over the work, but it's hard to sort of pin down how many have been involved in some way or another. Certainly, what I have noticed is that, and there really isn't any room for complacency here, because even though the sort of routes we're finding out about the work are pretty good, and I think a lot of schools are, even if they don't know it's called the DIS project or they don't know the label maximise the impact of teaching assistants, they will be familiar with some of the principles and ideas behind it. It seems to have sort of got out there sufficiently enough now for that to have happened. But doing it and doing it well, but that is a much smaller number of schools, because this is work that we don't shy away from this when we talk about it. This is not a flick you switch. So this is not a switch you flick. This is a kind of long-term strategic and operational piece of work that you put in with the schools. So the schools that come to mind who have done this particularly well are the schools that recognise that right from the off. They realise that this is going to be 2, maybe 3 years work. It's going to involve everybody in the school. It is going to mean stripping things back from what they are now to really kind of fundamentally assessing what they've been doing and what they want to do in future. Schools, I think, do this well. They actually make it part of their school development plan. They make it a priority. I think that's a really important lesson that we've learned from schools. They don't just do it alongside all the other things that they know are important. They make it an important thing that they invest time and effort in. I think that's another perhaps useful message that we've learned from schools, is that this is not about, when we talk about investment, it's not that this is going to cost you any more money. It's you need to invest in terms of time and effort.
Yeah, time. Yeah, so any school leaders listening, Rob is saying it's worth it, but it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think any good thing is really, isn't it? Any kind of good. But I mean, Just thinking about any examples of schools that you've worked with where you thought, yes, this really worked well. Do you have any to share with us?
One that comes to mind almost immediately each time I'm asked is a school in Bradford who was part of a project that we've had funded by the Education Endowment Foundation. So they funded us over the course of a couple of years to run our programme in the context of a randomised control trial that we're still awaiting the results of that trial as we speak. So I can't tell you whether or not it's had an effect just yet.
I think that's cool. Add some mystery.
We'll be able to talk about it another time, perhaps. But yeah, we know enough from the involvement that we've had with some of these schools, like the one in Bradford. Yeah, there is impact there in the sense that they seized on this opportunity to really kind of look at what they were doing with their practice with teaching assistants and a bit more wider than that. So I think one of the kind of key things that we've learned from the schools and where it is working well, and this school in Bradford is a prime example of that, is that this is kind of taken as a leadership responsibility. So in the schools where we know this is working well and embedding, it is because the head teacher really cares about it, really cares about the teaching assistants and really cares about the children in their school enough to think that, I really want to kind of do something about this. And so the leadership aspect is critical. And I think I think what's really interesting this is the way this has evolved, not just from the sort of practical recommendations of what we think schools should be doing in terms of deploying TAs and how they should be acting with children, but what you might refer to as the sort of implementation challenge as well. Actually, doing this stuff requires a set of conditions, if you like. You have to be, as a leader, ready to meet the challenge. You have to have staff who are willing to come with you. It's been quite interesting over the years that we've had schools that take this on, and even though it's very clearly labelled maximise the impact of teaching assistants, it does cause anxiety among some TAs in some schools. A big part of that has been what we've seen with cuts to school budgets. In that context, this could be seen as some kind of some sort of ulterior motive about rationalising the number of TAs. Now that's not our motivation at all, and schools that do this well, they don't approach it from that perspective. But you
Mm.
have to be really mindful of. Another school in the project that we worked with, they took that element of it really seriously, because if you don't have your staff on board with you, whatever it is you're doing and whoever it is you're doing it with, you just won't get off the starting line because people will
Mm.
resist it, they won't understand it, they won't want to understand it. And there's a whole kind of set of other processes that kind of sit around this, even before you get to the practical guidance that I've talked about. We are becoming ever more mindful of what schools need to think about to sort of maximise the impact of maximising the impact of teaching assistants.
I'm really glad you talked about kind of anxiety, and you talked about the fact that, it's challenging work, but, it's more about sort of investment and trying to bring out the best and trying to kind of establish kind of this community kind of feel in schools, in a sense that, everyone's in it together, and, everyone's trying to work together. And I think it's really great that you said that.
Mm.
And another thing I was thinking about, I think your work is so cool, Rob, and it's really great that what you said about the fact that it's called maximizing the impact, and there's these big names, but actually the work's trickled down to everyday kind of school language, and it kind of changed in a sense. And I think that's really important, that it's become something that is seen as part of school life. So I think that's really, really great. The other thing you said was about cuts, and you said something about cuts and budgets. And I think that links to what I was going to ask you. And, you've talked about how important teaching assistants are in working with children and pupils with SEN. So if there are budget cuts, and, there's this worry that, teaching assistants might not keep their jobs, or might kind of restructuring might take place, what impacts that going to have?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're kind of right to be concerned about that because, as I said earlier, the way we do inclusion in this country, and we're not alone in this, but the extent to which we've kind of relied on teaching assistants to facilitate the inclusion of children with special needs in mainstream settings is almost absolute. If you took the teaching assistants away, if you took that a third of the primary and the infant school workforce away, then you would leave teachers struggling massively to meet the needs of all the children in their classrooms. If you want a good example of the impact of teaching assistants, just think no further of what would happen if we took them all out of schools and just told schools to kind of, they have to kind of survive now without teaching assistants. You would see impact almost immediately. Schools, some of them just won't be able to function past, 4 or 5 days of that kind of setup. So I think it's fundamentally recognizing the role that they're playing. There is a danger of getting hung up on the impact assessment side of it. If you can't see some kind of impact in pupil outcomes, then it's not worth doing. I mean, teaching assistants are probably the best example I can think of. I'm a bit biased there perhaps, but one of the best examples that I can think of something that has clear impact, but it's actually quite resistant to measurement. The things that they do in schools, helping the sort of social development, helping peer relations, just helping the school to move along, even helping teachers just getting through the day just by being another adult in the classroom. Some of these things aren't easy to measure, but in the aggregate, as I said earlier on, if schools know this, they absolutely recognise this, and they will talk about value and impact, in some of those
Mm.
somewhat more abstract but no less important terms. So I think as we're kind of stepping forward, we've seen the impact of the budget cuts more in secondary schools than primary schools. But it is, I think, perhaps the warning, if you like, to policymakers or who ultimately kind of make those kind of decisions that impact on budgets
Mm.
is, if not teaching assistants, then what? If we're going to maintain our levels of inclusion, and that can always be improved, absolutely. The special needs provision in our mainstream schools, there's room for improvement there. But we're not going to do it with teaching assistants, and how are we going to do it? That question needs to be answered.
I hear what you're saying, like they have a hidden value. And,
Mm.
I was kind of reading about kind of what you had written about the fact that they might have ties within the wider community, and they might kind of within schools, they might know families because they've been there for a long time. Is that, could you say more about that?
Yeah, it's quite often the case that a school will draw its teaching assistant workforce from the sort of immediate community, the catchment area, and just slightly wider of that. Whereas with teachers, they
Mm.
generally kind of travel in from a bit further. So the TAs are a bit more rooted in the school community. So they do know about families. They do know which families might be struggling a bit more than others. They do know the children. They might even have had children that have
Mm.
gone through the school. You think about the parent helper model, these are people who had children at the school and they were coming in to help. So they have a long-term attachment in some cases to the
Mm.
school, and a sort of
Mm.
emotional investment. And in some senses as well, the turnover of staff, TAs compared to teaching assistants, there's much more churn with teaching staff than there is with TA staff. And in a way, the TAs are almost like the kind of institutional memory in some cases of the school. And again, that has a value. And a teacher who is like really kind of focused on
Mm.
all kinds of things to do with assessment and curriculum, and all the children in the class,
Mm.
the TAs can sort of focus on, perhaps those, what draws
Mm.
their attention is, that handful of children who are struggling a bit more in the classroom.
Rob, I hear what you're saying. Teaching assistants seem to be so important to kind of schools' everyday functioning. And I mean, just thinking ahead to the future and where we're at now, I imagine that teaching assistants are really going to be important as schools begin to open again.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very much what I think is around the corner for us. I mean, at the moment, schools are currently closed as part of the lockdown measures, and actually, it's very hard to move the work of teaching assistants online in the way that we have for teachers. TAs do this kind of often one-to-one support. You can't kind of do that in the same way that you can by moving teaching and providing work online. So at the moment, the TAs are, not able to do a huge amount. But I think that's all about to change. When the schools do reopen, whenever that happens to be, it's going to be very noticeable very early on to school leaders and to teachers how great those gaps have got between pupils in their learning. And we fully anticipate that to affect disadvantaged students more than their more advantaged peers. And there's already some sort of indications that might be happening just on the basis of who is accessing and school work and turning it in as well. So that being the case, I think all the predictions are that some of the progress that has been made over the last 10 years or so is potentially going to be lost. And I think this is where teaching assistants are, they can be a huge part of the resistance to this, in terms of deploying them to lead catch-up programs for the children who are falling behind. Now, I've already indicated that the evidence for that is really, really good. And I think what I would hope that school leaders are thinking about at this time is how they are going to use their TAs as part of addressing this gap that is opening up, and how they are going to use them to deliver programs outside the classroom. We know that this stuff works. We know which programs are more effective than others, and we know the conditions under which they've been found to be effective. And I think it's that kind of wider strategic positioning that school leaders need to think about, so the children who are coming back after shutdown or schools don't fall into the trap of interventionalizing them to death. They say you need an intervention for phonics, you need one for reading, you need one for numeracy skills, because the balance there is really important. A key thing that schools need to be thinking about is, if they do use TA to deliver interventions, and I think, it's not about whether or not you do that, it's how you do it. It's that they make sure that those children aren't sort of dragged out from lessons that they really enjoy. If you've fallen behind in maths, there's no reason why you should lose subjects like PE or art that you really enjoy to catch up with more maths. So this kind of comes back to the point I made earlier about the sort of wider strategic thinking that's going on. But in my mind, the TAs might not be doing much now. There's not a lot we can do, but I think they are going to be instrumental going forward when schools are identifying where the gaps are, which children need what in order to catch up, and the way in which they use their teaching assistants to address that. And I think you could see, some schools, kids make some fairly rapid progress, but that has to be sustained. So, my colleagues and I are doing quite a bit of thinking at the moment about how we might support schools to do that. The kind of key things, if you like, they might need to be thinking about right now.
Oh, that's great. I mean, it seems like challenging times ahead, but it's great that, you are starting to think about solutions for what's to come. And Rob Webster, it was just absolutely brilliant talking to you, and fascinating to hear about your work, and just such important work that has real meaning for many schools and for educators. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
You can follow our guest on Twitter at @RobWebster_, or go to the IOE website. Remember, there are more podcasts from the IOE ready for you to listen to on your favorite podcasting app. Just search for IOE Podcasts and have a listen to our Spotify playlist of our guests and podcast team's favorite hits to get you through the lockdown. Just search Research for the Real World. I'm Humera Iqbal.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education, University College London.